All right, we are live, and I will leave you to it. Salam.
Hello, everyone. Hello to the three of you guests, and hello to our audience. Thank you for joining this webinar titled BDS and Our Movements for Justice, the Academic Boycott at the American Anthropological Association. My name is Sami Hermez, and I'm an anthropologist at Northwestern University in Qatar. This is the second installment in a series of webinars designed to inform the AAA membership about the BDS movement in the lead up to a vote in the association on a resolution to boycott Israeli institutions. The voting period will open this June 15 and run for 1 month till July 14, 2023. In 2005, inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, over 170 Palestinian civil society organizations launched the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign as a way to hold the Israeli government accountable for ongoing human rights violations. Activists around the globe have responded to this campaign, with more than 24,000 academics taking a stand for Palestinian rights in May 2021. Most recently, the Middle East Studies Association, MESA, passed a similar resolution to the one before the AAA membership. Before it, the British Society for Middle East Studies and the Middle East section of the American Anthropological Association had passed resolutions as well. So too have the American Studies Association, the Association for Asian American Studies, the Native Women's Studies Association, the Arab American Studies Association, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, and the National Association of Chicana and Chicano Studies. So this is not the first time the American Anthropological Association has put forward such a resolution. In 2016, after 3 years of educating the AAA membership on the situation in Palestine, the resolution narrowly missed adoption by a razor-thin margin, losing by just 39 votes with over 4,800 members voting. Anthropologists who support this boycott have put forward this resolution again because Israeli violations of Palestinian education and basic human rights have only continued with impunity and gotten worse since the 2016 vote. Today, there is a broad-based consensus among human rights organizations that the Israeli state is an apartheid state, something our Palestinian colleagues have been arguing for decades. In our webinar today, we will be discussing how BDS connects and intersects with other movements for decolonization, demilitarization, and abolition. We hope that by listening to this webinar, you will leave with a better understanding of why we should boycott Israeli institutions, especially for those who are coming from a place critical of US settler colonialism, or working against US state repression, or thinking in the tradition of decolonial feminism. We also hope you'll leave inspired to think across movements and to practice solidarity. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to begin by introducing each of the speakers, and then we'll go through 2 rounds of questions with each of them. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that we're going to go forward with the discussion. So first, we have Dr. Sara Ihmoud, who's a Chicana Palestinian anthropologist whose work uplifts the lived experiences, histories, and political contributions of Palestinian women and Palestinian feminism. Dr. Ihmoud's scholarship has been published in American Anthropologist, Feminist Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Studies, State Crime Journal, Jerusalem Quarterly, and Biography. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Palestinian American Research Center, the Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research, and the National Endowment for Humanities. She's a founding member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and assistant professor of anthropology at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Next, our next speaker is Dr. Orisanmi Burton, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. His research employs innovative ethnographic and archival methods to examine historical collisions between Black radical organizations and state repression in the United States. Dr. Burton's work has been published in North American Dialogue, The Black Scholar, American Anthropologist, and Radical History Review, among other outlets, and he's received support from the Wenner Grant Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the Margaret Casey Foundation, which selected him as a 2021 Freedom Scholar. Dr. Burton's first book, entitled Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, will be published by the University of California Press in October 2023. Congratulations on the forthcoming book. Finally, last but not least, Dr. J. Kelani Kawanui is a professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty in anthropology at Wesleyan University, where she teaches courses related to critical indigenous studies, settler colonial studies, critical race studies, and anarchist studies. Dr. Kawanui is the author of Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity with Duke University, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism, also with Duke, and Speaking of Indigenous Politics, Conversations with Activists, Scholars, and Tribal Leaders with the University of Minnesota. Her work is widely published in a range of academic journals and edited books. Dr. Kawanui is one of the 6 co-founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, established in 2008. She's the recipient of the Western History Association's 2022 American Indian History Lifetime Achievement Award. I also want to add that she recently published a piece that's on the Boycott.org website, which is a beautiful reflection on how to support both Palestinian and Native American struggles and the commitment to end settler colonialism. So thank you. Sorry, it's a bit long introduction, but we have 3 distinguished speakers with us, and I wanted to give time to all 3 of your bios. I want to begin. I'm going to begin with Dr. Sara Ihmoud. Hi, Sara. Sara, you've written about Palestinian feminism and Palestine as a space for enacting feminist praxis. Can you share what brings you to BDS and speak to why feminist anthropologists should support the academic boycott?
Yes, thank you so much, Sami. I want to first thank our AAA colleagues who have generously organized today's conversation, along with our colleagues at Jadalia who have helped to host this event, and my colleagues with whom I am in conversation today. Thank you all for being with us, and it's an honor to be able to speak with these issues. To answer your question, I came to the BDS movement both through my experience as the daughter of a Palestinian refugee who was displaced from his homeland, and as a graduate student in activist anthropology at the University of Texas, who was immersed in the study of Indigenous women's struggles in another colonial context, that of Guatemala. One afternoon, while meeting with a group of Maya feminists organizing in the aftermath of the genocidal violence of their country's civil war, one of them spoke at length about what she witnessed as part of a delegation of women of color to Palestine. She spoke about our people's struggles for liberation as interconnected struggles for Indigenous rights, invoking the history of Israel's provision of weapons and training to the military regime at the height of genocidal violence in her own country, alongside a wider anti-colonial solidarity politics between people of the global South and the Palestinian liberation struggle. That conversation was a seed for me. Learning from the survivors of genocide in Guatemala, alongside a broader history of transnational links between colonial and genocidal states and Indigenous, feminist, and anti-imperialist resistance throughout the region, gave me a particular lens through which to understand what I would witness during my first trip to Palestine. My father was among at least 140,000 Palestinians deleted from the population registry under an Israeli military policy in the early 1970s as part of a silent transfer, a quieter form of ethnic cleansing. He was not allowed to return to his homeland except after many years and as a visitor on a tourist visa. Visiting Palestine for the first time after finishing my master's thesis on Guatemala and being racially interpolated as Palestinian by the Israeli state during that first attempted border crossing, being ushered into a segregated waiting room in Tel Aviv with all of the other Palestinians, being treated like a criminal, having the intimate details of my personal and family history interrogated by Israeli border police for several hours, being picked up by a taxi driver with a yellow-plated car because my own family was not allowed to cross the checkpoint from our village in occupied territory or drive on Israel's segregated road system to receive me, seeing the Israeli settlement that had colonized part of our village's land for the first time that evening. These are the mundane experiences of everyday life for Palestinians living under apartheid and settler colonial rule. These same conditions, those of exile from or in one's own homeland, of criminalization and violence, of institutionalized theft of one's land, and the embodied sense of racial terror one feels navigating a space where you know that you are killable, that you are disposable. These are the conditions that I navigate as a Palestinian ethnographer each time I attempt to gain access to my homeland. It is this lived experience, my own and that of the people I care for and love, my family, the Palestinian communities to which I belong, the people to whom my work as a feminist anthropologist is accountable, that brought me to the BDS movement. My teachers in the Austin School, part of a lineage that Jafari Allen and Ryan Jobson referred to as the, quote, decolonizing generation, the, quote, cohort of Black, allied, anti-racist, feminist, and political economy-oriented scholars that gave rise to the landmark volume Decolonizing Anthropology, edited by Faye Harrison, taught me that if we are to position ourselves within this discipline, that the methods of anthropology can and indeed must be used in service of the, quote, imperatives of political and epistemic decolonization, end quote. Our aim is to produce knowledge in service of social movement that contributes to the liberation of Black, Indigenous, and all other peoples from, quote, socially constructed limitations and diminished life chances. The struggle against racism being one of the fundamental organizing elements of our perspective. While teaching and the production of insurgent knowledge is itself one form of resistance, we aim to, in Edmund Gordon's words, quote, push our work past discourse to praxis, end quote. As traditions of critical feminist anthropology teach us, we cannot understand race absent its intersection from the mutually constitutive formations of gender, sexuality, class, and other axes as they are lived and embodied in various social locations. While feminist ethnography does not have a single definition, Donna Ain Davis and Krista Craven emphasize that a core element is, quote, a commitment to engaging in research that is socially and politically relevant to those we study, and that challenges marginalization and injustice, end quote. Indeed, feminist ethnographers are in a key position to reassert the central feminist connections between theory, methods, and praxis. Our political commitment and scholarly choice as feminist anthropologists emerge from the radical intellectual and political traditions of Black feminism, Chicana feminism, Indigenous and Arab feminisms, queer feminisms, and other traditions that persuasively posit that listening to knowledges, movements, and expressive projects from below and in between power axes provide the most powerful critical locus and compass for the work that we do. Critical feminist scholars have contended that part of the work of dismantling a hegemonic Western ontology that gave birth to the discipline of anthropology and to which it remains tethered today is a principled engagement with struggles against intertwined systems of racial capitalism and colonialism that continue to be its lifeblood. By affirming an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist feminist anthropology, we are also affirming the core belief that our political commitments to the production of feminist knowledge must be intertwined with praxis and our commitment to actively confronting systems of gendered and racial precarity, while also dismantling the, quote, structure of the nation state and its local and global extractivist and expansionist systems of genocide and war, ethnic cleansing, displacement, and dispossession, end quote. BDS is one such opportunity for feminist praxis, as Israel's ongoing settler colonial project remains an enactment of genocidal violence against an indigenous people through technologies of war, capture, and militarized dispossession, vested in the, quote, idealization of the nation state and its hierarchical understanding of humanity. And I want to speak a little bit more to this construction of the Zionist state, of the Israeli state, for anyone who may be listening who does not have a full understanding of what this project is. So to expand, Zionists arrived from Europe to a land that was already inhabited. Instead of seeking some form of integration within the social and political frameworks of the indigenous population and the wider Eastern Mediterranean region, they have worked to destroy our social relations, our connections with each other, and to our homeland, and to replace this framework and our native population with a political community of their own. In speaking to a community of anthropologists, one important aspect to highlight here is the racial characteristic of Zionism as a movement. As historian Alain Confino has argued, quote, Zionism as a movement brought together Eastern European style late 19th century and early 20th century ethno-nationalism with the practices and racial ideologies of 19th and early 20th century British style settler colonialism. Zionism is one movement within a whole host of others that viewed ethnic homogeneity as a precondition for the construction of a European style political order and ethno-national states as the natural building blocks of a modern global order. Hence, to quote Palestinian scholar Noura Arakat, quote, what is happening in Palestine today is not at all exceptional, but a wider and continued reverberation of the failures of European nationalism and empire and its structures of global white supremacy, end quote. Indeed, in discussing the central contradiction of the Zionist project, Palestinian historian Shireen Saikali details how, quote, a people who were promised entry into the category of the European only if and when they left Europe would be led by a movement that embraced the very nationalist and civilizational hierarchies from which it sought refuge, end quote. This contradiction illuminates how Palestinian liberation is intertwined with the liberation of all oppressed people who are marginalized by the exclusionary categories of race, the nation, and the human. Engaging this project requires that we recognize the interlocking nature of the many structures of violence such as racism, classism, heterosexism, patriarchy, and colonization, and that we work to transform the conditions that give rise to these structures. The BDS resolution before us today offers just such an invitation. The invitation to enact principled engagement as a praxis of critical anti-racist, feminist, and decolonial anthropology. It is one among a series of strategies that seeks to name and interrupt the lethal and ontologically disruptive gendered racial colonial power of the Israeli state. BDS is a Palestinian call for global solidarity in the form of boycott of, divestment from, and sanctions on Israel until it abides by international law and ends its violations of the human rights of the Palestinian people. As Palestinian feminist scholar Neda Elia reminds us, quote, the majority of Palestinian women's and feminist groups, including the General Union of Palestinian Women and Palestinians' Federation of Women's Action Committees, are amongst the initiators and signatories of the 2005 call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. A call for solidarity with the Palestinian people signed by over 250 civil society organizations in Palestine, modeled upon the call for solidarity with Black South Africans that US feminists had embraced in the 1980s. At its core, the call for BDS is about Palestinian freedom from apartheid and the constraints of ongoing ethnic cleansing. While Palestinian civil society has been making this analysis of apartheid publicly since 2005, these conditions have been thoroughly documented and evidenced, not only by Palestinian scholars, lawyers, and activists, but also by some of the leading human rights-based institutions of our time. By Human Rights Watch in 2021, by B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organization in 2021, and by Amnesty International in 2022. In short, global human rights defenders amplify that whether they live in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as colonized subjects, or within Israel itself as second-class citizens, Palestinians are treated as an inferior racial group and systematically deprived of their rights. Israeli academic institutions are a key part of the ideological and institutional scaffolding of this regime of occupation, colonialism, and apartheid. In the words of the Palestinian Campaign for the Cultural and Academic Boycott of Israel, quote, since its founding, the Israeli Academy has cast its lot with the hegemonic political military establishment in Israel, and is profoundly implicated in supporting and perpetuating Israel's systematic denial of Palestinian rights, end quote. The AAA's own 2015 Independent Task Force on Israel-Palestine underscores that in considering our membership's engagement in this context, we must consider our commitment to human rights and to academic freedom, both of which had been significantly curtailed under the conditions of settler colonialism and apartheid. Further, quote, anthropology has a particular responsibility that no other discipline has to oppose settler colonialism and modes of social domination that mobilize categories of race, ethnicity, and culture that earlier generations of anthropologists were complicit in constructing, end quote. Finally, quote, as the American Anthropological Association, we should be particularly sensitive to situations of suffering and injustice that are actively enabled by the resources of the American state and other US institutions. While the association should consider taking a stand wherever fundamental human values are violated, it may feel particularly moved to do so in situations where the US provides military or other kinds of aid that sustain systemic violations of basic rights, end quote. To conclude, Laura Deeb and Jessica Winiger argued nearly a decade ago that, quote, Israel-Palestine politics can be considered a bellwether of anthropology's future, end quote. Today, we have an ethical and political obligation as anthropologists to act, standing with the Palestinian people in their struggle for freedom from settler colonialism and apartheid. A vote for the BDS resolution is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a commitment that we as anthropologists will continue to do the work of decolonizing a discipline that has played a foundational role in constructing the very logics of race and civilizational hierarchies that place Palestinian life in peril today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and we'll return to you a bit more, but it's a lot of food for thought for the moment. I wanted to move on to Orisanmi and ask you sort of similar question related to your own work, but if you could share what brings you to BDS and speak to why anthropologists committed to the critical study of US prisons, war making, and state repression should support the academic boycott.
Sure, it's an honor to be here, and thank you to the co-panelists, and thank you to Sarah for that really lucid and moving statement that I think really clearly lays out what's at play. I want to kind of follow your lead and talk a little bit about my own experience. I mean, I remember growing up as a child, there were several products that were just off limits in my household because my parents supported the BDS movement against apartheid South Africa. My father's a photographer, but I remember that he refused to use Polaroid because of how that technology was used to create IDs that Black South Africans were forced to carry around. And you know, I wasn't allowed to drink soda as a child, but all Coca-Cola products were especially prohibited because Coca-Cola had a major market in South Africa. So that's sort of how I came to BDS. My parents made it very clear to me as a child that the least we could do as a family was to withdraw our support for institutions that buttressed and profited from the apartheid regime in South Africa. More recently, I traveled as part of a delegation to Palestine in 2018, where I witnessed the regime of Zionist colonialism and apartheid firsthand. I saw the apartheid wall that cuts through Palestinian neighborhoods and keeps their communities confined in geographic space, right? And that wall is adorned with beautiful protest art, right? But I just remember thinking that if that art wasn't there, the wall looks exactly like the prison walls that enclose US carceral spaces where I do my research. And whole families are living behind these walls. I passed through the pervasive checkpoints where Palestinians are surveilled, harassed, and forced to suffer daily indignities simply because they are Arab or because they are Muslim. On multiple occasions, our bus would be boarded by a heavily armed member of the IDF who would walk down the aisle and invariably would stop amongst a bus full of people and ask me to show my papers, right? To show my ID, my visa, to ask me how to pronounce my name. And it never escalated beyond that, right? But it was clear to me that I was being singled out because I was a youngish Black male. And it was infuriating because of how familiar it was, right? As I've had similar experiences in the United States. And of course, this would be the best case scenario, right? That you're only questioned by the police rather than being detained, brutalized, and killed, right? But it's still a form of terrorism because that possibility is always there. And this further solidified my sense that this was not only an anti-Arab and an anti-Muslim regime, but an anti-Black regime. I saw the Jewish-only roads that facilitated smooth transportation between illegal settlements and the different license plates that marked drivers as either citizens of Israel or residents of Palestine. And I remember thinking that there's no moral or ethical justification for this. I met an Afro-Palestinian man named Ihmoud who taught me about the history of Black Palestinians. He told me that he was considered to be a resident of Jerusalem and must constantly prove that that city is the center of his life or he'll lose his residency status and suffer displacement like so many others. His wife of more than 2 decades and their children live in the West Bank and are therefore prohibited from visiting Jerusalem without special permission from the Israeli government. And he and many others who I met while I was there asked me to share their stories and asked me to support BDS. And so that's what I'm doing, right? So in terms of why other anthropologists should support BDS, this is one way to show your solidarity with a colonized and oppressed people. This is what Palestinians are asking us to do. And it's really the least we can do. It's a nonviolent action designed to put pressure on a racist and oppressive government, one that is a major bulwark of imperialism around the world, right? The Israeli government supported apartheid South Africa and white supremacists, the white supremacist government of Rhodesia during the 1970s. It supported the military junta in Argentina. As Sarah just mentioned, it supported the genocide in Guatemala. Israel is one of the largest arms exporters in the world, right? It doesn't publish information about those exports, making it very difficult to figure out the full scope. But we know that it ships weapons to an estimated 130 countries, including to conflict zones like Rwanda during the genocide, to the Serbian army during the Bosnian genocide, to South Sudan during the Civil War, to Myanmar. The Haitian National Police and the gang factions who have killed hundreds of Haitians this year are armed to the teeth with assault rifles manufactured in Israel, right? So these are some of the reasons why anthropologists committed not just to the critical study of war and state repression, but to critically interrupting these processes. These are some of the reasons to support the academic boycott, right? Because we know, at least in theory, how hegemony works, right? That these repressive technologies have to be developed and tested, that the colonial regime has to be solidified, buttressed, rebranded, that colonial intellectuals, right, that academics, their role is to legitimize the status quo, to rationalize racism and violence, to spin the narrative in ways that ultimately blame Palestinians for their own subjugation, while portraying colonial violence as security, counterterrorism, law and order, democracy, and so on. And so again, the Palestinian people are engaged in a liberation struggle. This is part of their strategy. They're calling for solidarity, and offering it in the form of a boycott of Israeli academic institutions is really the least we can do.
Thank you, Orisanmi. That was a strong case listening to you. I wanted to move to Kelani, and again ask you a similar question, and then we'll sort of circle back. But if you could share what brings you to BDS and speak about what insights anthropologists committed to the critical study of U.S. settler colonialism bring to the question of the academic boycott, and particularly why you believe scholars based in settler states should support this resolution? Because I think that's one of those questions that often comes up.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really good to be here. I appreciate the invitation and to be on this session with all of you, and to be able to share my thoughts about this particular juncture we're at within the association, and at this point in terms of the global solidarity campaign for BDS, standing with Palestinian civil society. I might just speak really in a brief way about some of the formative moments prior to my own trajectory in terms of coming to the BDS struggle. Just as flashpoints, I first learned about the Palestine freedom struggle from June Jordan, the late Caribbean American poet, essayist, and playwright and activist, when I was a student at UC Berkeley. And this was during the early 90s, during the first Intifada. And it was through her poetry and her speaking out in protest that first sort of woke me up to the struggle. I wasn't public, I was still learning. And then the next sort of critical moment for me was at what we had in 1993 in the Hawaiian Islands called Kaho'okolokolonui Kanakamali, also known as the Hawaii International People's Tribunal. And one of the international judges was a Palestinian legal scholar and activist at the time, Asma Khader, who's based in Jordan. And at the end of the 10 days of that tribunal, holding the US accountable for crimes against Kanakamali people, also known as indigenous Hawaiians, Asma Khader on video and in front of everybody at the closing session said that she was really struck by the similarities in terms of the violence that Native Hawaiians experienced. And she's the one that drew the analogy between the Palestinian people and the Hawaiian people. And that really struck me because I didn't see them in the same frame. And she wasn't trying to say that the expulsion was the same, but really speaking to the structural location of both in terms of holding on to land and all of the social crises and violences around different kinds of expulsion, whether it's coercive outmigration or ethnic cleansing in a more blatant way. And then the next sort of formative moment for me was in 1997 when I was a graduate research fellow at the National Museum of American History. This is prior to the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. And I was doing comparative research on Native Hawaiians and Native Americans. And I met anthropologist who was also doing doctoral work at the same time, Nadine Neber. And it was Nadine who first, for me, drew the comparison between Native Americans and the Palestinian people. And that really stuck with me. And then the next one that I would mention is getting to meet Stephen Salaita in 2007 at a conference at Oklahoma University that was the precursor to the formation of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. And we met there and really talked about some of these structural positionalities and the violence between US settler colonialism and Israeli settler colonialism that are really beyond analogy, really talking about the material entanglements in those formations. And so by the time I was asked by the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, as the founding collective members were setting up US ACB in the midst of Operation Cast Lead, in those long weeks between the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, the organizing collective, the founders asked if I would serve on the advisory board for US ACB, and I agreed. And I've been slowly and surely learning more and more. I mean, by then, the broader BDS call had already been launched in 2005 by Palestinian civil society. I also like to remind people who have a particular issue with academic boycott. There are some people that say they can deal with, say, product boycott, but not academic boycott. I like to remind people that Palestinian civil society made the call for academic and cultural boycott a year prior to the broader BDS call, and that was in 2004. So obviously they prioritized it, and I think that we can talk about why that might be the case. By 2012, I was part of a very small US ACB delegation to Palestine, and that was with Robin Kelly, Nefertiti Tadiar, Bill Mullins, and Nikhil Pal Singh, and really learned on the ground as much as possible. And that was my first of 3 visits there. And I think one of the things that I want to just circle back around to in terms of BDS and academic boycott in particular is the claim that academic freedom is a violation. That academic boycott is a violation of academic freedom. And I want to just take that on front and center here, because the academic boycott and the cultural boycott, for that matter, is an institutional boycott. It's not about boycotting individuals. And that doesn't prohibit me or anybody else who endorses from having an academic exchange with an individual scholar in an Israeli academic institution, or inviting people to our campuses to speak and so on. I have actually invited people in those campuses to be part of conferences and also Wesleyan speakers. So there's nothing about that. But also in the context of the AAA, there's nothing in the resolution that is binding for individual scholars within the AAA as it is for the AAA, right? It's an institution to institution resolution. The other thing that I wanted to kind of highlight is this idea that academic boycott is punishing scholars on the other side, if you will. And I find that really curious. I mean, I have tended to just ask people, how do you see it as a violation of academic freedom? Give me an example. And inevitably, they will talk about something that the actual parameters of the campaign do not call for. So we're already talking outside of the parameters of what the campaign asks. But also this idea of punishing scholars. If I decide, say, not to give a lecture at Tel Aviv University, for example, or Ben Gurion University, not that I've ever been invited or anticipate ever being invited, but the idea that those scholars there would feel punished to not, say, get to hear me talk about Hawaiian sovereignty or US-based anarchist activism is flattering maybe, but just not really there. So that idea, and it dodges the question of attacks on academic freedom for those of us who dare criticize Israel in the US Academy and elsewhere. And it also sidesteps what Amy Kaplan called out as the de facto boycott of Palestinian academe, and specifically regarding scholars. She was talking specifically about scholars in the occupied territories, but I think we can also talk about that with Palestinian scholars in Israeli institutions in 48 Israel. So with that, I just want to circle back around to the question around settler colonialism and the positionality of anthropologists and other scholars in settler colonial states. I think this is where it's really important to understand Israel's political project as a settler colonial one. I understand occupation and apartheid as part of a broader settler colonial aim, as legal regimes and military regimes in the service of settler colonialism. In other words, I don't understand the occupation as an occupation in and of itself for that end. And for me, that's another segue to, say, Hawaii, right? The US military backed local settlers who tried to take over a democratic monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. There was a hybrid situation. It had modicums of democratic practices, but this was a fully fledged independent nation state that the US military backed 13 settlers on the ground that overtook the Hawaiian kingdom and subsequently annexed unilaterally without any treaty or consent of the people. And people might think of the Hawaii-Palestine comparison as absurd, right? And part of that is we've got to tear away, I think, the myths around Hawaii because of Hawaii's beauty and the tourist fantasies and whatnot. But when you're really looking at military occupation, it was after the US annexed Hawaii that it opened up Hawaii to settlement. And then the US subsequently annexed. And then, you've got that 1893 overthrow. You've got 1898 annexation, and by 1959, you could say that the US sort of fulfills the completion of that annexation from its own perspective governmentally, and that is 1959, 50th statehood for Hawaii. All of those are in violation of international law that were operative at the time, as well as the US Constitution. And so the reason I mention that isn't just to sort of get Hawaii into the picture, but to understand occupation as a means for settler colonial expansion. And that's what we can see in the West Bank, right? You've got an illegal occupation that Israel will deny as an occupation, flooding that territory with settlers, right? Breaking up land contiguity between Palestinian villages that's been going on for decades. And then basically a de facto annexation, even if it's not completely within the legal regime at this stage. So I think that for me is one of those understandings and insights that anthropologists committed to the critical study of US settler colonialism can bring to the question of academic boycott. And I've had these conversations within the American Studies Association, where I helped move the resolution, and also within the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, where the council ended up making a declaration. They didn't actually move our resolution, but part of those campaigns really open up space for education and mobilization, and really testing the debates and people's misunderstandings often, and some of the fear around what this means. And also, to a lesser extent, I participated in the AAA campaign back in 2016, more in an advisory capacity. The other thing I might say is that this is an opportunity to really think about our ethical consistency in terms of what we find acceptable within the norms of and the precepts of international law and human rights. In terms of our field, it's an opportunity to understand and differentiate between different forms of colonialism and non-consensual domination. Anthropology in its decolonized form is all about the study of power and domination and cultural logics and agency, whether it's individual or collective, within the confines of structural limitations. I also want to highlight, this issue of settler colonialism being centered as a land project, right? And that's the difference. One can have an occupation that isn't about centering land expropriation. For example, the US has held the colony of American Samoa since 1899. It's a US colony. It's eligible for decolonization under the United Nations Committee of Non-Self-Governing Territories. And it's a sign of US imperial domination and militarization. But I don't consider it a site of US settler colonialism. You don't have American Samoa being flooded with settlers to try and eliminate American Samoans. American Samoans are the vast majority. They make up over 90% of the population, and they hold over 90% of their land. That looks really different when you're comparing it to, say, Hawaii. And if you look at, say, Guam, it takes on another sort of hybrid, if you will, between settler colonialism and military occupation. We can look at Puerto Rico, we can look at the US Virgin Islands, we can look at the Northern Mariana Islands. These are opportunities to also understand what the ways that US itself as a settler colonial state has different practices and iterations of different kinds of colonial domination. And I also want to highlight, sometimes people get really anxious around, say, Patrick Wolf's theory of settler colonialism and talking about it as binaristic or pushing back on the idea of indigeneity for Palestinians. And for me, I want to speak to that. I think one of the things that's so profound about his theory is that it is portable, right? There are earlier theories of settler colonization, going back as far as I can tell from the work that other people have done, tracing back to Australia. Geographers have talked about the role of settlers in colonization, and they were coming up with theories of settler colonization as early as the 1920s. There's also the important work of Fayez Sayegh, who produced a document called Zionist Colonialism in Palestine in 1965 through the Research Center of the Palestine Liberation Organization in Beirut. And he talked about racial elimination, and it really is resonant with Wolf's theory of elimination of the native. I think that Wolf's theory isn't specific to one particular geography, although to really make the case for that theory, he was looking at Israel, Palestine, the US, and Australia. And he didn't use the word indigenous, he used the word native. And I want to just point out that native and indigenous, some people use them interchangeably. They are not necessarily one and the same. But also that for me, this isn't about foisting an indigenous identity on people that might not identify as indigenous, but to understand that within these theories, these are structural positions, not identities, right? That idea of the native being colonized by a settler colonial formation, being targeted as native, or in the case of Hawaii, being targeted as indigenous. And so we might think about that. But the reason I bring it up is understanding structural genocide, right? Is that elimination itself in Wolf's theory that I think builds on Sayegh's theory of racial elimination is to understand that elimination can take many forms. It can be outright mass killing, but it can also be through expulsion, through ethnic cleansing, through forced removal. And in the case of Native North America, for example, in addition to those other forms, can also take the place through coercive forms of biocultural assimilation, of eradicating the native as native, if you will. So just wrapping up, for this particular question. I just wanted to also point out that I think that, we hear so many of our colleagues talk about the US as a democracy, and, just thinking about, upholding Israel's myth of itself as a democracy without really reckoning with the fact that colonialism, occupation, and apartheid are antithetical to the democratic process and to democracy, but also understanding, de facto apartheid. I wanted to also make sure, because I'm focusing on settler colonialism, to really also think about the de facto apartheid system that's still in place in the US through mass incarceration and policing, and also the criminalization that comes with gentrification. I believe that scholars based in any state, whether it's settler colonial or not, should support this resolution, or those that are based in the US as members of the AAA who work on other parts of the world. But I think the positionality of settler scholars and settler states, and particularly in the US, should enhance rather than distract from our responsibility to heed the call. And that's really what my piece that I put in the chat box around the Native American question as a false dilemma is that, I've seen people who are opposed to BDS and apologists for Israel or outright Zionists really try to evoke the Native question as a silencing moment, as a gotcha moment, to detract responsibility, or to even detract from looking at Israel's violence against the Palestinian people by saying, well, you're hypocrites, what about Native Americans here? And for years, I would try to respond to that in earnest, taking it as a sincere question, and really came to find it's really a red herring. These are not people the people raising these issues aren't typically the people that care about tribal sovereignty. Because if they did, they would know that the forces that are at work here in the US are in alignment with Israel to actually pulverize indigenous land holdings here as well as there. I mean, one of the most obvious that we could look at is Christian evangelical communities in the political right in the US are not in support of tribal sovereignty and indigeneity here. So that's one example. But the idea is to really expand our ethical consistency and not sort of set up a false dilemma that, because people here aren't doing enough for Native American struggle, therefore they shouldn't actually support the Palestinian call. No, you support the Palestinian call because it's the right thing to do. And then to actually step it up in terms of your own social location and stand in solidarity with indigenous peoples and all oppressed peoples. But in this case, specifically talking about the ongoing land grab. I mean, look at the pipeline struggle here, for example. So those are just some of my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Kalani. I think so. We have about maybe 15 minutes tops, and I think with each of you, you sort of stepped into the other question I was going to ask. But so what I want to try to do in the remaining 15, 12 to 15 minutes is maybe in 5 minutes or less. And I'll give you like a 1 minute thing that nobody else will be able to see, hopefully, to maybe either respond to what others may have said, or really sort of dive a bit deeper into sort of the connections with your scholarship. So I'll start with you, Sarah, and you've already touched on some of this, but your scholarship and work with Palestine Feminist Collective centers on women's resistance movements and transnational and decolonial feminism. So the question I had was if you could speak to the ways the BDS movement builds on and with feminist organizing, and situate the boycott in the broader context. So I think you've sort of said some of this, but if you wanted to sort of expand, I give you, sort of a few minutes to expand on that and, maybe react to what others have said, if you like.
Yes, thank you so much, Sami. And I will do my best to stay within 5 minutes. It's been so generative to hear you all speak on this. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, again, feminist organizing in Palestine in the US, and sort of how the BDS movement builds upon these transnational feminist connections, and also is an expression of an anti-imperialist, abolitionist, demilitarizing struggle. So feminist organizing in Palestine has been deeply invested in dismantling structures of settler colonialism and apartheid that place women and queer folk disproportionately in marginal positions. Like in other colonial and genocidal contexts, Israel has targeted the bodies and sexualities of Palestinian women as symbolic peripheries of the Palestinian nation in the efforts not only to deter our capacity to give life to future generations of Palestinians and hence alternative sovereignties, alternative futures in our homeland, but also in the efforts to fragment Palestinian social relations and deter organized resistance. Feminist movements in Palestine have historically organized to confront through various strategies the racialized and militarized apparatus of the colonial state, from mobilizing against imperial efforts to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, to forming the base and leadership in popular rebellion against occupying forces, to creating the social, political, and economic alternatives and embodying resistant practices that have sustained Palestinian communities in everyday life. Despite our histories of exclusion from feminist spaces, including those considered progressive or radical, Palestinian women and queers in the space of the US-based Shatat or diaspora continue to build a thriving feminist movement that centers engagement in abolitionist and anti-militarist struggles. As our communities have historically been interpolated through what feminist anthropologist Nadine Nabat theorizes as a, quote, diaspora of empire, end quote, a term reflecting a defiant racial and gendered consciousness rooted in the disavowal of US empire and its interlocking with structures of genocidal violence, racialized policing, and carceral war, where we find ourselves positioned today. Placing these movement building histories in conversation allows us to see not only that the geographic boundaries between Arab homelands and diasporas are fluid and overlapping, but also that our struggles against racialized and gendered colonial violence, militarization, prisons, and war in the US are deeply intertwined with those in Palestine. In the building of Palestinian feminist movements, joint struggle or coalitional work with colonized Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, and other historically marginalized groups has been central. These histories are revitalized today in conversations about Black Palestinian solidarity, decolonization, and contemporary anti-imperialist feminist approaches to abolition, all of which recognize the deeply intertwined gendered racial logics of Zionism, genocide, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, militarism, and imperialism. These are the conversations that are helping to shift the tide of discourse toward Palestinian liberation, in spite of the ongoing hegemony of Zionism in the US Academy. Palestine has always been a site of both decolonization and abolitionist praxis. A coalitional approach to decolonization and anti-imperialist feminist abolition invites us to affirm in the analysis of Nadine Nabat and Clarissa Rojas that, quote, if we want to abolish prisons, we are going to have to dismantle systems that cage and punish, while also dismantling the structure of the US nation state and its local and global extractivist and expansionist systems of genocide and war, ethnic cleansing, displacement, and dispossession. Okay, thank you. The BDS movement is an opportunity to continue this legacy of coalitional, decolonial, and anti-militarist and abolitionist feminist movement building. It is an invitation to deepen our reciprocal relations of care and struggle, refusing the violence of Israeli settler colonialism and its entwined logics of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, heteropatriarchy, and racialized economy of suffering and death, that it exports via its military and surveillance industry to support the authoritarian repression of social movements across the globe. At the same time, the BDS movement builds on decolonial feminist praxis as it is animated by the urgency to nurture and create alternative ways of being, knowing, and belonging to each other, not rooted in hierarchical structures of race, gender, nation, and humanity intertwined with the coloniality of power. And I'll just wrap up by saying, as Palestinian feminists, we understand that settler colonialism and state violence are invested in destroying our capacity not only to imagine life and a future in a liberated homeland, but also to desire it. As Savannah Shange powerfully reminds us, quote, abolition is about attending to the break, stretching open the cracks in captivity's infrastructure, end quote. Just as this urgent Black feminist abolitionist vision potentiates a set of social conditions where prisons and captivity are unfathomable, it is these same social conditions we must fight for to make war and empire and colonial occupation no longer relevant or even imaginable. And that is the invitation of BDS to denaturalize the oppressive carceral formation of settler colonialism, to cultivate further this rebellious aesthetic and praxis, and this feminist value of BDS is not only material, right? It lies in the power of the imagination, of liberating our collective imagination for freedom. And that in itself fundamentally, I think, shifts these dynamics of power and landscapes of struggle. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sarah. I didn't want to cut you off. I mean, it's beautifully
No
said.
worries.
But I feel like I'm on a sort of live television production, and I need to get
Please.
us. Orisanmi, if you can sort of pick up from there and speak to the ways you understand the BDS movement to be in the tradition of foreign conversation with Black-led movements for demilitarization and abolition. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to share comes from my 2018 trip to Palestine, which occurred shortly after an article I had written in the Black Scholar came out about the New York City jail rebellion of 1970. And I shared that article with a Palestinian anthropologist named Lina Miari. And we started talking about the parallels between the prison movements in the US and in Israel, Palestine. And she kindly organized a speaking engagement for me to talk about the article in the West Bank and this sort of outdoor amphitheater in the West Bank. And this impressive crowd showed up. It was 50 or 60, maybe more, intergenerational crowd, lots of young people, some movement elders, students, workers, organizers. And Miari transferred my remarks to Arabic. I don't remember what I said, but I remember the Q&A because the questions were so sharp and they reflected a keen understanding of the broader context of Black radicalism within the United States, from which the rebellions I was writing about sprung. And the questions, especially from the young people, cut right to the heart of what I would call the colonial relationship under which Black people in the United States live. And to be perfectly frank, I remember wishing that my students, including my Black students in the US, had a similar handle on the history, right? And then afterwards, I talked more to some of the students and they asked for permission to translate the article into Arabic. Of course, I said yes, and I later received a copy of the translation and this beautiful pamphlet that they made. So the whole exchange helped me understand in a different kind of way the extent to which Palestinians comprehend the value and the relevance of Black radical histories to their own struggle, right? They study it because they see value in it. They study it because of the parallels. They study it because it offers insight into what they're going through. And so that was a really profound moment of recognition for me. I could talk more about some of the history of Black Palestinian solidarity, but there's a lot of great writing on that subject. So I just finished a book on the Black radical prison movement in the US, and part of what I do there is to treat incarcerated rebels and revolutionaries as theorists and philosophers of war, of empire, of the human, of a whole range of things. And one of their key insights is that they never really theorized the prison on its own terms. They theorized the prison, the physical structure of the prison, the bars, fences, and walls. They theorized it as a distillation or a paradigm for understanding how power is operating in the broader world, right? So Malcolm X talked about this when he said that to be Black in America is to be born in prison, and to be formally imprisoned is really to be imprisoned twice. And this theory has extreme relevance to the Palestinian struggle, right? A population who lives under a sort of normalized carceral regime of normalized surveillance and normalized punishment. So that's an area, I think, of generative sort of theoretical and methodological overlap. And it's interesting that you see this sort of playing out in the respective prison movements. So in 2016, as hundreds of Palestinians confined in Israeli prisons were on hunger strike, incarcerated people in the US organized the National Prison Strike of 2016, potentially the largest such action in US history. And so we see this happening again and again, these sort of parallels between the various movements. Also, while I was in Palestine, I learned about the concept of Ihmoud, which I think translates to steadfastness, inner strength, perseverance. And this is a concept that resonated with me because I understand the sort of logic of genocide under which Black people in the United States live is one that attempts to essentially preserve the body, but kill the inner spirit. And so that kind of, that concept really resonated with me because I think, that's very much a concept that although we don't necessarily have a word for it, Black people in the US, engage in that kind of practice of trying to keep this inner spirit alive amidst this sort of like pervasive onslaught. And then the last thing I'll just mention, I know I'm probably over time, is just, I would encourage folks to look up a 2017 report called Deadly Exchange, which is just about the history or about the broader context of carceral technology exchange between the US and Israel. It excavates the links between these different technologies of control via surveillance, racial profiling, immigrant deportation, immigrant detention, and other forms of state violence. It also is a framework for helping sort of law enforcement agencies engage in public relations that help spin their tactics in ways that make it seem, more palatable. And then lastly, I'll just point out that there's a Black radical formation called Black Alliance for Peace, which just released a statement that's trying to excavate some of the connections between the police training, US police training in Israel and the Cop City urban warfare training facility in Georgia, which at a time when the world is literally on fire, I can see smoke out of my window. They're trying to destroy more than 300 acres of land that's on, land that has not been ceded by indigenous people to build an urban warfare training institute. And that this is again tied to this broader regime of settler colonialism. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Orisanmi. I'm going to jump to Kehlani and sort of in the same sort of direction. I want to ask you, you've been an outspoken supporter of the boycott, and your scholarship investigates indigenous sovereignty and so on. So what are the ways you understand the movement to be speaking to or intersecting with indigenous-led movements for decolonization? And how might we understand decolonization in relation to transnational political developments? And I guess you also sort of touched on this in your comments. So maybe just if you have a few more words to finish us off.
Okay, how the BDS movement both speaks to and intersects with indigenous-led sovereignty decolonization in 3 minutes. I think one of the things I just want to highlight is that the BDS movement, like a lot of indigenous struggles, cite law and international law as a tactic, not as the be-all and end-all, and not as the fulfillment of a liberal promise, but really holding states to what they have imposed or tried to impose around the globe of the rule of law, and really holding them to their own rhetoric, if you will, right? The officials of those states that claim them, and the law itself was built on colonialism. So the law is not the savior, but I do want to just point to the fact that it can be used tactically, right? If I can talk about the illegality of the US hold on Hawaii, in the 1893 overthrow, the 1898 unilateral annexation, and the 1959 fraudulent statehood, right? That's a political leverage point to expose the taking, to expose that. And to me, that's part of the work of anti-normalization. And Sarah mentioned, denormalizing these regimes of power, I think is so important. I think that one example that we could look at is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? It's not an actual international convention. It's not international law in and of itself. It's merely a declaration. It's an aspirational document. But that doesn't mean it's worthless or pointless. I mean, indigenous individuals and allies worked on it for, over 3 decades to get that passed in 2007. And one of the main parts that people have used to mobilize around protecting their territories are the provisions for free, prior, and informed consent for any projects that are to happen on indigenous traditional lands. And so I think that, this land question is just not going to go away. I think also I want to point to the fact that settler colonization is still not illegal under international law. The decolonization protocols that I mentioned earlier that were passed by the General Assembly of the UN in 1960 were built on franchise colonies. And they used a criterion for that you had to sort of have a blue water in between the colony and the colonial metropole, also known as the saltwater thesis. So these are interesting developments in terms of the political mobilization, because people are really using and identifying Israel as an apartheid regime, which I think is accurate on the face of, in terms of the law, the laws themselves and the legal regime. Apartheid is illegal under international law. Settler colonization is not. Right. And then obviously occupation is also illegal, but Israel tries to redefine its occupations as non-occupations. So I think that part of these intersections really is about the land back movement. And I think that looking at the land back movement and all of its attendant practices, it's not just about transferring land back into indigenous hands, and that's a movement sweeping North America for one, but to really think more broadly about what that means, because so many of the social ills and the structural violences are offshoots of that land dispossession, and to put the land back movement in and the abolition movement together. And so for me, it's decolonization in conjunction with abolition. And I think the example that we just heard around what's going on in Cop City and the forest, and that's exactly where you're seeing the nexus of that, as well as the intensification of militarized fascism through policing and beyond, and the climate crisis or climate extinction and eugenics, frankly. The other thing I might just point out, which I think you see Palestine at the crossroads of having this long legacy of third world struggle and solidarity, but also being subject to the practices that would that aim to reduce Palestinian condition to the fourth world. Right. And that's the condition of indigeneity. So that's about whether Palestinians want to identify with the indigenous project or not. I always point out that Israel certainly sees them as indigenous, even though it did not disavows Palestinian prior existence or indigeneity, if you will. And I'm using that sort of as a placeholder. So for me, this really is about anti-normalization and refusing the logic and the structural practice of elimination of the native, however we define native. And that is also, I think we just heard too, around the colonial power that also has a racializing technology. And so it's not just indigenous peoples, say in the US, and we just heard Orisanmi talk about, the coloniality vis-a-vis Black people in this country. And so I think that, again, putting those two together is really important in relation to specifically for the US state context, but to really think about BDS as part of the work of anti-normalization and to really, again, extend that ethical consistency and think about the implications of critiquing the state of Israel and always turning back to what's going on here too. And not just as a point of comparison or analytical interest, but to also understand the material connections between the US and the state of Israel. And the deadly exchange is one of those many examples.
Thank you so much to the three of you, Sarah, Orisanmi, Kalani. This was such a rich conversation, and I wish we could continue it and really sort of talk more about solidarity and even more moving towards shared struggle and thinking more about these things. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you're part of the AAA, please vote on June 15. And vote yes. And we will hope to see you all soon in our next webinar. Thank you.
Mahalo. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I am not sure if we're supposed to leave or stick around, but I guess we can just end it here since we're still recording.
Well, I just wanted to thank you all. This was really great. It was great. Thank you.
Yeah, I learned so much from you all. Thank you so much for being in conversation. Oh, here you, Caroline.
Pardon me, I was saying thank you so much. I really appreciate being on the session with you, and we'll be in touch. Take good care.
Likewise.
Aloha.
Everyone. Bye.